Well, I think it is good to make it, write essays and post video essays online. I think that in itself can be a good thing to just create memes and help change the world that way indirectly. But in addition to that, I think it's also a good idea to participate, to at least try to participate more directly with the political process by contacting representatives, not both in a national and local level. And I'm trying to work harder to do that. Just recently, I wrote some essays. Wrote some letters to my congressional district, U.S. House Representative Angie Craig, regarding the Venezuelan issue, urging her to do what she can to end the sanctions against Venezuela. In my first letter, I did not write. I've written two recently. Well, just one last night, and a number of them a number of weeks ago. I wrote another one. The first letter I wrote, I did not I was not aware of the acts of that have been passed some years ago that allow the president to issue these sanctions without going through Congress at all, just through fiat declarations. So essentially, the president acts as a dictator in issuing these sanctions against both Venezuela, Nicaragua, and also Cuba, against those countries. And so I wanted to add on to that, and I responded to her response in my second letter that asking her to repeal. I think it's the National Emergencies Act and an International Emergencies Economic Powers Act are the two acts that seem to allow the president to issue the sanctions against other countries. So like there's no emergency in the U.S., but we're declaring emergencies. The president is declaring emergencies to ironically essentially cause an emergency in another country in order to get them to capitulate to U.S. Capitalist, imperialist powers. So that's the whole absurd purpose of these declarations, emergency declarations. So now my second letter, I urge the Angie Craig to repeal those two acts. And what I did not write in the letter, but I also have been thinking of, is how the absurdity, how the double standard that's being used to justify declaring those emergencies in order to issue the sanctions. They justify it by claiming that Venezuela is unfair, unjust, undemocratic in their government, in their current government. But regardless, regardless of the fact that it's untrue, largely untrue, and President Carter has said that they have the greatest elections in the world, most democratic elections in the world, said something along those lines. And also they look after their poor people. Essentially, these are progressive governments in these Latin American countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba. They're doing these socialist experiments, and then the U.S. does everything to try to sabotage those experiments, and when and if they do fail, and insofar as they're not working, it's due to the efforts of the U.S. Imperialist interventions to sabotage those socialist efforts. But instead, the right-wing nuts claim that look, socialism is failing again. But when in reality it is things like the sanctions that are causing the failure, not the socialism itself. But regardless of all that, regardless of the fact that they are a sovereign nation, it's none of our business whether or not they're democratic or not. because regardless of all that, you have this double standard hypocrisy where, look at Saudi Arabia, where we do everything we can to help them, despite the fact that nobody's claiming they're democracy. They're not even close to democracy. They're a royal royal family is a dictatorship over the country. There's no democracy whatsoever in Saudi Arabia. They engage in all sorts of human rights abuses, especially in the case of Yemen. And there's that journalist, but that just doesn't never used as a justification for sanctions. And then instead, there's the U.S. does everything it can in its power to help Saudi Arabia. So there's just a great deal of hypocrisy in that double standard there. But yeah, so I just wrote the letter to another letter to Angie Craig, urging her to repeal those two acts that make it possible to implement those sanctions against Venezuela and other Latin American countries. I'm thinking that's the Democratic Party is supposed to be the left-wing progressive party, and that's what those countries are trying to implement, those principles of leftist progressivism. And so we should be doing everything we can to help them in their socialist experiments because they're the ones that are supposed to be, they're the ones that are actually making an attempt to implement progressive policies. That's what so the Democratic Party should be doing everything in its power to help them. And the big way to help them would be to repeal those acts that make those sanctions possible. But yeah, I'm not ignoring also there's also the fact that Obama is the first one that started the sanctions against Venezuela, using those same two acts as a justification for authority for doing so. So we have a big problem in the Democratic Party. That's a whole other issue. I did not write that in a letter, but that's a whole other issue of the Democratic Party has been taken over by neoliberal corporatists, and that needs to change. But enough of that. So now I'm gonna edit in the letter I wrote, the most recent one. I can't find the older one that I wrote. I think I wrote it to the senators also. Tina Smith and Amy Klobuchar are the first letter. I've never heard back from them. I'm sure I wrote them, but I can't find the letter. I'm pretty sure I did. But anyways, yeah. So now I'm gonna edit those where I'm gonna read the letter that I wrote to Representative Craig. Thanks for watching. Mm-hmm. Now here's the letter that my U.S. House representative in my congressional district, what she wrote me back in response to my first letter I wrote to her, where I protested the U.S. sanctions against Venezuela. She wrote me back here, and it's just the first short paragraph here where the matter of Venezuela is mentioned by Representative Craig. In it, the first paragraph, she writes, "Thank you for contacting me about the important issue of the unfolding humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. I am hopeful that the situation can be resolved, and I am wary of further American involvement beyond aid in what is an internal Venezuelan issue. I am monitoring the situation closely and will be sure to take your views into consideration should this issue come to a vote on the House floor." And then, but that's the extent of the response to the matter of Venezuela. So I find that it's good. At least she believes it's an internal issue in Venezuela, but it's not a. I think we need a more direct approach to solve the problem. I think that the existence of those acts, the economic emergencies, National Emergencies Act, and the International Emergencies Economic Powers Act are what are justifying or giving authority to the president to, by fiat, issue those sanctions against Venezuela without congressional authorization. Therefore, we need to repeal those two acts. And I did not mention those acts that need to be repealed in the first letter that I wrote that Representative Craig responded to in this letter. So I just last night wrote another letter to Representative Craig. Here's what I wrote. Letter to Representative Craig by me. I wrote, I'm glad to hear in your response to my last comment that you believe the issues in Venezuela are an internal matter to that country. However, I believe that a direct approach is necessary to end U.S. interventionist meddling in Venezuela and other countries such as Nicaragua and Cuba. The U.S., through the imposition of sanctions, is effectively engaging in siege warfare tactics against Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba in an effort to get those countries to capitulate to U.S. capitalist interests. The sanctions the U.S. is imposing are made possible largely by way of the National Emergencies Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It is through those acts the POTUS may bypass the legislative branch of government entirely and often effectively bypass the judicial branch as well, thus allowing the POTUS to act as a dictator who imposes his will on foreign nations without any representative measurement whatsoever. The three branches of government in the U.S. were not created by accident, but out of good reasons. The requirement of legislative approval for significant policy action by the U.S. should never be viewed as merely a nice thing we should try to strive for when it's convenient. The acts mentioned above act as a loophole, allowing for the bypass of the very political process that makes this country a representative democracy. And insofar as the loophole is taken advantage of, a dictatorship exists in the office of the U.S. presidency. Therefore, I hereby call for the repealing of the National Emergencies Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So that's the letter I sent. I hope she reads it. All right, we've had a number of executive orders issued, starting with Obama, that have implemented sanctions against Venezuela. And here is the latest one, Executive Order 13884, the blocking property of the government of Venezuela. And they all read basically the same, except of course when Obama was president, it had it has his name on there. But so it's the first paragraph is what where the claimed authority to implement the sanctions is stated. So it says, by the authority vested in me as president by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, including the United States, including the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the National Emergencies Act, and it goes on to say give a couple other claims for the authority. But I think mainly it is those two, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and the National Emergencies Act, that are being used to justify implementing the sanctions against Venezuela and other countries also. It's used as their justification for the sanctions against Nicaragua and Cuba, and I believe Iran also. So that's why I believe we need to repeal those two acts. And that's why I wrote to Representative Craig, arguing for the repeal of those acts.